Good evening and welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director. I'm so delighted to have all of you here tonight. One little piece of housekeeping first. This has to do with the comfort level of everyone in the audience with the speakers removing their masks when they're talking. How we do this is simple. If you feel, well, at the same time, if you feel comfortable, thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. If one person puts their thumbs down, we don't remove our masks. So 1, 2, 3, up or down. Okay, great. You can understand us a lot better when we take this off, right? I appreciate that. We are working hard here to ensure that we may gather safely and productively in the midst of the ongoing pandemic. So I appreciate everybody for wearing their masks and allowing our speakers to take off their masks for the conversation. As I said, welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. If you are a member, raise your hand. I'd love to see. Oh, most of you. If you are a visitor and you've been here before, raise your hand. If you've never been here before. Welcome to your first time to the Athenaeum. So most of you have heard my spiel before and know that the Athenaeum is an amazing part of the historic community of Philadelphia, a place that from the beginning has been where people come to read and research, to learn, and to be in conversation together about what it means to be a community, where we gather around art and literature, around history and architecture and preservation, and all of these questions and as they coalesce with our daily lives. And we believe that what is really the richness of the Athenaeum is not this amazing space, this old place, but it is the centuries of conversation and community that has been built here. And so we're grateful to each one of you for joining us as part of this community. If you're not a member and you find that you like what is happening here, please don't hesitate to talk to me or any one of our staff. You can see in the back, Bruce and Tom and Mike raised your hands about what it means to be a member, and we would love to have you join us. Tonight is a really fun conversation. I've already had a preview of it on a Zoom conversation we had earlier this week talking about the logistics. We're here to talk about Tom May's book, Why Old Places Matter. And just so you know, Carly from Head House Books is in the back with copies to buy. It's a beautiful book and a wonderful book. If you don't have it yet, buy it for yourself. Buy it. Holidays are coming up. There's always a holiday or a birthday to gift someone with a good book. Tom Mays is the author of Why Old Things Matter. He is the Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel for the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Washington, D.C., and came up tonight to be here with us. We're so grateful to you, Tom, for doing that. He's also a bit of a foodie, and it's fun to talk about restaurants with him, too, when you're not talking about old buildings. He has written and spoken widely on preservation law, the underlying purposes of historic preservation, and the future of preservation. And for many years, he taught historic preservation law at the University of Maryland. Now, when we invited Tom, he said, can I do this in conversation with some other people? And we talked about various people, and we thought two great folk for him to be in conversation with are Randall Mason and Starr Herr-Cardillo. And I'm grateful for them both being here tonight. Randy is professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design. He's a senior fellow at Penn Praxis and former chair of its graduate program in historic preservation. And since 2020, he's served as founding faculty director of the Weitzman School of Design's Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites. And Starr Herr-Cardillo is a freelance writer and historic preservation professional who works in the nonprofit sector, and she has a master's in historic preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. They bring questions to bear to Tom's work, which helps push it in new directions, and I think the three of them together can help us think about what we talk about when we talk about preservation, what we talk about when we talk about old places and why they matter and to whom they matter, and they help us widen that circle. So I invite you all to join me in warmly welcoming Tom and Randy and Starr to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia tonight.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Randy, for being a part of it. Thank you, Starr, for being a part of it. And thanks to all of you who have signed up to come to this really spectacular place, which I have never been in before, to hear us talk about why old places matter. And I can't imagine a better place to talk about it. It really exemplifies some of the reasons that old places matter, and we'll come back and perhaps talk about that. The book grew out of work I did through a fellowship at the American Academy in Rome, which is why I have this picture of the American Academy up. And I always have to acknowledge gratefully both the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the American Academy in Rome, which permitted me to do this work. The book was published in 2018. I do hope you will acquire a copy from Carly in the back of the room from Head House Books. Randy has one, as you can see, but I hope you will give it a read, and I'm grateful to Rowman and Littlefield for having produced the book. What I want to do is just give you a taste of some of the ideas in the book and where these ideas came from. Before we jump into the conversation, I'm just going to talk for maybe 10 minutes about this piece of it. I started writing, coming up with the idea for the book from teaching historic preservation law at University of Maryland, where Randy was at that time. And at the beginning of every one of my preservation law classes, I would have a conversation with my students, who were usually graduate students in historic preservation, about why we have historic preservation law. And very quickly, the conversation would become a conversation about why we have historic preservation at all. And I was a little bit surprised to discover that many of my students, who were graduate students in preservation, did not necessarily have ready answers for why we had preservation. And they would typically default to ideas that come out of our statutory language. So they would talk about saving our heritage, although it's not entirely clear what that means. Or they would talk about preserving property values or revitalizing communities. But those ideas didn't really seem to me to get to the deeply felt sensibility that people that are involved in preservation or care about old places seem to feel. So I set about trying to collect these ideas together, and ultimately I wrote about 14 ideas. And I don't think these 14 ideas are the only ideas. In fact, I think that there are as many reasons old places matter as there are places and people. But I hope as I talk about a couple of these ideas and then we have this conversation, you'll be thinking about why the old places in your life matter to you, how much you are aware of them or not aware of them, or how you would explain to someone why an old place matters to you. And you can also think about this particular place, why it makes a difference for the Athenaeum and its programs to be here in this historic place and here in this historic building, or not. Does it not make a difference? So the 14 reasons I ended up writing about included these that are shown on the screen. And I sort of break them down into three large categories. There's the category that I think of as the most fundamental, which is about continuity and identity and memory. And then there's some ideas that are about the way old places inspire us with creativity, with sacredness, and even with beauty. And then there's a host of more practical reasons. Economics, how old places promote community, or how they lead to a sustainable future. So again, I don't think these are the only 14 reasons, but these are the ones I ended up writing about that are in the book. Now, I'm going to talk with you just slightly more deeply about 4 of the concepts, because I think they are most likely to lead to change in how we view preservation. And let me just jump right into a couple of these. First is continuity. This is the idea that old places provide people with a sense of continuity that is important for our psychological and emotional health. And I quote this environmental psychologist, Maria Lewicka: "The majority of authors agree that development of emotional bonds with places is a prerequisite of psychological balance and good adjustment, and that it helps to overcome identity crises and gives people the sense of stability they need in the ever-changing world." And we see this in places throughout our community. I usually use the example of schools and churches. And then there's the idea of individual identity. And people have recognized this link between place and individual identity for millennia. Cicero wrote of returning to his grandfather's house. And James Marston Fitch, the noted preservationist, wrote that preservation affords the opportunity for the citizens to regain a sense of identity with their own origins, of which they have often been robbed by the sheer process of urbanization. And we can all think of the places that are associated with our identity. I use a church in North Carolina that my family had long ties to. But my identity with places also changed over time. So I have a sense of identity with DuPont Circle, shown in the upper right, in the American Academy in Rome. And even the mall of my junior high school years, Eastland Mall in Charlotte, North Carolina, which might lead one to question, how old does a place have to be for people to form these attachments with it? Individual identity. And then civic identity. The preservation world has long honored these places, and I use this photograph of Independence Hall in all of my presentations, believe it or not, even though we're only a block away. The preservation world has long championed these types of places. And preservation has often been about patriotism and national identity. But I found as I talked with people about patriotism and national identity as a reason for old places mattering, people were uncomfortable talking about it. And I think that's related to the idea that is illustrated by this quote from Edward Said: "The vexed issue of nationalism and national identity, of how memories of the past are shaped in accordance with a certain notion of what we, or for that matter, they really are." One of the things that's interesting to me is that these places of national identity or civic identity become the venues for our changing identity over time. For most of preservation's history, people were left out. Slaves were not even mentioned at plantation houses. Native Americans were treated as the enemy at frontier forts, and countless workers were simply not mentioned at the places where they worked and lived. And yet, that changes over time. And now we are recognizing those people in a different way and recognizing the associations that were simply not revealed in the past. I use here also an image of a Confederate memorial from my hometown in Cornelius, North Carolina, because it illustrates the extent to which old places can become lightning rods for this sense of changed identity. And it can also perhaps highlight for us when it's time to let an old place go. Old places are part of our civic identity. I use this image of the Bamiyan Buddhas too to remind people of the sense of loss that people felt generally when those were destroyed. And the same sense of loss was palpable when we saw the flames shooting from the roof of Notre Dame Cathedral. That was a part of our universal identity that we were feeling. And then the last of the ideas of the 4 I wanted to just briefly touch on is about sustainability. That old places foster a more sustainable world. How do they do this? Through more ways than people currently recognize. First, the reuse, or simply the continued use of old places, makes sure that less new construction happens on green fields. It preserves habitat and open space. It also, old places are typically built in areas that are more dense and where transportation corridors already exist. And in addition to that, it avoids these demolition materials going into a landfill and recognizes the embodied carbon that are in these buildings. The National Trust Research Lab has estimated that it takes 10 to 80 years for a new building that is 30% more energy efficient than an old building, for the new building to recover the demolition environmental cost of new construction. 10 to 80 years. So I think that sustainability is not recognized more broadly as being associated with old places. Yet I think it has the capacity to change preservation and the way we view preservation. So, and this is the quote from Carl Elefante, "The greenest building is the building that's already built." And that brings us to the Athenaeum and some of the conclusions I had from writing the book. And I'll go through just a couple and then jumpstart the conversation. One is that I finished this book, and I am a die-hard preservationist. I've always been a preservationist. And I came away from it thinking, these places are actually more important than I thought they were, and for more reasons than I thought they were, and for reasons that surprised me. However, I also came away thinking that our tools that we primarily use to preserve places are not all designed to capture some of these most fundamental reasons. Our tools are mostly designed to capture architecture and history, and not necessarily that sense of belonging or continuity. So with that, I will jumpstart the conversation, and I was going to ask Starr and Randy first a three-part question. Do they agree that old places matter? I sure hope so. 2, do they think most people think that old places matter? And 3, how could we help people understand that old places matter more? And I'll turn to Starr first.
Great, thank you. Can people hear me okay? Okay, good. Yes, I think old places matter. I think most people feel old places matter. It was very nice and helpful for me to revisit your book last week, because I feel like I've spent 2 long years holed up in my house, reading all the news and complicating my relationship to preservation and how I feel about it. But I was drawn to it because of a lot of the reasons you outlined in your book. I think I'm one of the people who feels mostly excited by the inspiration old places give me. I get it. I just get excited. I respond to them emotionally. I have conversations with so many people about those things, or about them having similar reactions, feeling similar ways, and those are often people who don't identify as preservationists, per se. So I definitely think they matter to many people. I think it gets a little tricky when you cross into, when you move from old places matter and just kind of generally appreciating them into preserving them, because that act is much more loaded than simply appreciating something. It implies some sort of hierarchy of significance, of importance. It requires some level of authority to kind of grant a place that significance. And like you said, our tools are very skewed towards privileging the physical, the architecturally significant, the beautiful, kind of the top tier examples of things, and that excludes places that are newer, it excludes places that have changed, places that might not be there anymore. And I think it also privileges architecture a bit over people, and I've been thinking a lot about how people being able to use and appreciate spaces is a key part of what makes them important. There's an example I've been writing about and thinking about a lot, a neighborhood in Tucson, Arizona, which is where I'm from, that was the target for urban renewal. It's called Barrio Viejo, and it's one of the oldest neighborhoods in town. It dates back to when Tucson was still a part of Mexico, and its architecture is like mud, adobe, Sonoran row houses. Which aren't dissimilar to Philly row houses. They're just one story, and they're made out of mud. But they're contiguous along the block. A lot of like live-work space when it was an active place, and a very lively street. All the things that we say are good urbanism today existed in that neighborhood. And that wasn't recognized in urban renewal. It was very thinly veiled, racially motivated urban renewal of the dusty old Mexican town. So 90% of it or so got razed, and then a handful of people, probably similar to our group here, like people who appreciate old places, zoomed in and they bought the last remaining houses that were still left. And they preserved them and they restored them. And you fast forward about, a few decades, and those are some of the most valuable houses in the city. They're on every tourist brochure. Diane Keaton just bought one for $1.5 million. But, the people who made that place what it is no longer live there. And now there's a push to create an NHL district for this neighborhood. And they're involving great people in that effort. There's a critical historian who actually had family that had been moved from the barrio. But it's frustrating that our tools can only kind of hinge that, a more nuanced, a more representative history, a history that goes through that troubling period, but you can only attach it to kind of this husk of a place that, it's the place is there, kind of, but it's not there. So I wonder how we can support people who care for places a little better.
Great question, Randy.
I think we should probably figure out the answer to Starr's question that she ended with. That I think is a great, is in a way the question. Is like how do we support the efforts that we believe in, and not try, as opposed to trying to change what people believe. Do we talk to the unbelievers, or do we try to support the folks who are already in one way or another on board, if you will? But I should answer your questions. So one, absolutely, old buildings matter. I'm tempted to be contrary and say, like, no, but
I sort of assumed you might.
Thank you, but not all in the same way, I would say. So maybe I'll come back to that. Do other people believe old places matter? Absolutely, I think they do, but we don't all act on those beliefs in the same way. And how to get people to believe, I think the third question was how to get more people to believe in that old places matter. Start with Tom Mays' book. Not just because you have an opportunity to purchase it now and you're hearing more about it now, but I think there are so many different ways to do that and so many different reasons to try to broaden the conversation about the different ways that, in your parlance, why old places matter. I tend to talk about like why they have value. I think they're synonyms, but I think it's fundamentally the same question. To to kind of ask people or invite people or maybe sometimes provoke them to be more explicit about what it is about old buildings or old places that it does matter to them, why they do have value. One of the other, so building on that, I think one of the reasons that Tom's book has gotten a lot of attention, rightly so, is that it is an invitation. Tom's exploration of these 14 ideas is, I think, it's written in such an open and generous way that it's easy for all of us to see ourselves putting pen to paper and writing that 15th or 16th entry, and some of us actually do, write in the same kind of really engaging, open vein, and that's important not just because that's kind of a good and upright thing to do and a way to engage people, but the discourse in preservation, if I can use that pointy-headed word, or the other things that people write about preservation, myself included, tends to be really clinical and kind of heartless. Again, I point that back to myself as well as my other sort of professional and scholarly colleagues in the field. So I think that the intentions and the feeling of this book are an important reminder that it's okay to feel about how old buildings affect me or affect you or affect us. I think it's an important part of the conversation that we need to keep nourishing. I think it also, the breadth of reasons, and you can stop me when I'm trying to keep my eye on the big clock, but if I get close to 7 o'clock, please cut me off. The breadth of issues, the 14, and you didn't need to stop there, but you did.
I was told I had to.
The publisher told you had to. I think that breadth of issues points to both the greatest strength and one of the greatest weaknesses that the preservation field confronts. And the strength is that we can all connect to a place in our own personal way, in a way that, I do it because I connect to Tucson because I know that Starr believes in it and I believe in Starr. So we can do it individually and collectively. We can do it because it's beautiful or we knew something wonderful happened there. For all the 14 reasons, they're just, you're challenged not to find a reason to love old buildings and to attach to them. On the flip side, I think preservation has always struggled, will continue to struggle, the lack of a center. Kind of a consensus idea that there's one kind of foundational, fundamental argument that on which the field stands. And if we ask everybody, if we went around, everybody would have that thing, but it would be different. Now, again, is that a strength or a weakness? I think it's a strength, kind of philosophically, morally, intellectually, but it's a weakness practically. And I think the particular weakness that the breadth of our reasons reveals is that there's always been kind of a mostly unspoken but still real difference between the ways that we love preservation as a cultural practice. And I think I was trying to keep notes of all of the categories of the 14. I think the majority of them are about preservation as a cultural practice. The other side of things is about preservation as a property practice, if you will. It's about property and economics and markets. And those two things don't necessarily connect to one another easily or well. Anything that connects to markets tends to result in winners and losers. Culture is the opposite. Culture is about multiplying the ways that people can possess and connect to places. And to the extent that, as Starr was saying, that if our laws and policies and professional education and our public debates are about property and regulating property, then we're working against this sense of preservation as this kind of broad and broadly supported cultural practice. I don't know the solution, but I always am feeling this tension between preservation as pointed at property and about property, and preservation as about culture and creativity. But you've got them both in this book, and so I think you're teeing up another way that we can try to reckon with that kind of, I would say, structural difficulty in preservation.
When it seems, well, first, thank you both for your generous comments about the book. I thank you. I think the connection really is in our practice turning toward people, to pick up on what Starr said. And cultural practice is all about people. So one of the things I always have been, or since I wrote the book, have been trying to push is taking a look at our practices and seeing how much we can return them to the people so that we're asking people in a community, what are the places you care about that you think should be preserved? And sort of flipping it from being a top-down process and instead have a bottom-up process. That's not easy to do. It's expensive. It requires a different skill set from the skill set most preservationists have. But it seems to me that it's critically important to think about it that way for the future of the field.
Mm-hmm. I love the idea of thinking about how we could move towards a more practical approach to preservation from a policy standpoint. Like you pointed out, sustainability taps into that. It just makes sense to reuse what exists. I think many people could get behind ideas like that. And I feel like, I don't know if that just means kind of widening our definition of what we think of as preservation, but I think home repair programs, that's something I think about in Philadelphia all the time. Giving people resources to maintain and upkeep their old homes. It's almost too obvious. Like, why isn't that what we do? Why do we instead tell you have to pick a certain paint color? I don't know.
I completely agree with you. I don't quite understand why the field doesn't and I don't mean to be critical about the field too much because it grew up as a grassroots effort to begin with. We have to remember that it was a radical notion in the 60s when we really first started embracing this. But I do think it's important to continue to try to make it more practical. And the thing that is really at the forefront of my mind is stability of place. How do we use the tools that are available to not gentrify neighborhoods, but to help residents stay where they want to stay, not force people to stay where they don't want to stay, but give them the tools to be able to stay if they choose to.
I think one route to trying to change this, practically how preservation gets taken up by, collectively and publicly, is to appeal to people individually, as you do in a lot of your narratives here. I mean, you're personal in some of the stories that you write, but it's also, you're kind of appealing to us as the reader to kind of see it through the lens of our own lives. And we're all preservationists. I defy this room is kind of obvious probably because you're here, but in any room that you're talking to, everybody has something that they've preserved for some totally irrational reason that some relative has given them, or that they bought an antique, or they saved a memento from a baseball game, whatever it is. So everybody gets that. And so I think it's kind of a matter of, like, how do you convince people that you deserve that individually, our family deserves that, our neighborhood deserves that, our city deserves that, and and on and on. It's not a radical idea if you just kind of see it as part of the kind of everyone's kind of normal life. The more kind of pointed version of that is that when faced with someone who's we can't afford that. I mean, we need new construction for more housing, and you just got to stop doing all that preservation nonsense to build more new stuff. When people start talking like that, ask them the last place they were on vacation. And 9 times out of 10, it'll be a place that would not exist if not for preservation. So there are all sorts of ways that we consume preservation and need preservation individually, but how to connect that to these public conversations. I think that has become more difficult in recent years because of our dysfunctional political culture. And I think policy changes, and you've suggested some really great policy changes, and other stuff that you've written, Tom, presumes that we have a political culture that enables that, and I think we're kind of lacking that at the moment.
I'll just drop a footnote to say it's interesting too that preservation has support from both sides of the aisle. So even though individual battles about preservation become quite fraught and it's difficult to talk about, it is a bipartisan field overall that does have political support from both sides. Part of the problem, as you pointed out, is when it bumps up against property, AKA moneyed interest, that can, overwhelm all of the communitarian support for saving a place.
Can I just follow on to that really quickly? That of the 14 things that you've got in the book, the economy is one of them. And I'm totally ripping off one of my economist friends, a guy named David Throsby, who's written a lot about the economics of culture and preservation. And he, as an economist, it seems a little bit, ironic coming from him. He said, whenever economics comes into the conversation, it wins, because it converts all of the notions about value or what matters to this common denominator of money. And there's always a better option to make a higher profit. And so there's the whole discussion about economics has this kind of colonial drive, kind of tendency to it. So it's really difficult to going back to what I said about culture and property. It's difficult to have a conversation about both at the same time without the kind of the colonial factor of economics dominating the conversation.
Well, there's also this reality that people's perceptions about what supports a strong economy or even the economics of an individual town don't necessarily match the reality. I mean, we have countless studies saying preservation is economically viable and it supports a strong local economy. It's just a different type of economy where different people are making money from it. And it tends to be more spread out in the community. And that's an important factor to remember.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, my thought when you're talking about this is I feel conflicted sometimes when, which argument do we go to? Sometimes they counteract one another. So the economic argument works in some circles, and you could, draw a map, show a map of the historic districts in Philadelphia and an income map of the city. And it's pretty clear that the historic areas are very valuable. I don't know if that says something good or something not so good about preservation, honestly.
I agree. No, I think that's a good point. I mean, the studies show that property values hold their value better and go up higher in designated historic districts. And there are a lot of different reasons for that at different places. But, it reminds me of that Rem Koolhaas critique of preservation, where he said, why don't you just, take random blocks of a town and preserve it instead of trying to preserve it the way we do it now. Whereas my response to that is, shouldn't we flip the whole paradigm and just make sure we're reusing every building? And then we have the stability built in. We're not picking and choosing from among them, and not everything has to be preserved under the Secretary of the Interior standards, but it buys a whole host of the benefits that are in the book. I know that's a radical notion. Just preserve everything. Nobody's surprised I said that.
But to paraphrase what I remember you writing in an earlier piece, let's change the system of incentives and taxes, public policies. We change them all the time. Let's change them so that there's, I can't remember if you said this exactly, there's a really substantial tax on landfill that you have to adaptive reuse is by right. And you have to get 3 special permits from 3 different L&I departments for building a new building instead of having the new building be as of right.
I mean, the truth of the matter is that demolition is subsidized by the government instead of fully paying its own way. And there are a handful of places that have changed that, have tried to change that paradigm, like Portland, where buildings are required to be salvaged if they are demolished. They're built before 1924, I think, and there's a fee that has to be paid for demolition of the building. So two disincentives to demolish, which therefore creates an incentive to reuse the building, not necessarily to preserve it under a historic district guideline, but it results in saving the building.
Yeah, I like the move towards, I mean, deconstruction is not preservation, right?
No.
But it is, the disincentive benefits us. But I think it highlights the value in the materials of the building. It identifies, you know, the damage that's done when that's just tossed in the landfill. And I feel excited that that the sustainability focus is moving a little bit more into the conversation. I feel like that's just it's so obvious. Like, we should just take that one.
And I think that should be a logical conclusion for anyone who reads the book, that we need more different kinds of preservation, as opposed to the kind of self-reinforcing Philadelphia system at the moment, where if it's only about architectural value, it's going to keep reinforcing the correlation with property value you were talking about. And that's, you know, if that's our intention, then we're doing a really good job of it. If our intention is to bring the benefits of preservation to a much broader geography of the city, then we need to change what preservation is, or at least broaden the notion, whether it's deconstruction or replacement materials, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. The tools are out there, I would say, but we haven't really made a serious effort at applying them here yet as a city.
I do think the tools are out there to try to do that. You know, we haven't talked about race very much, but I don't want to leave the conversation without picking up on that and talking about the way preservation is actively changing to be more inclusive, which it has not historically been. And in our pre-call, the question was raised, well, how would I write the book differently if I were writing it now? And I've been pondering that ever since. And I'm kind of, I am delighted and pleased to see the explosion in growth of communities that have historically been underrepresented, African American, Latinx, and to some degree LGBTQ and Native American sites, really exploding in interest. And I'll cite the National Trust-owned African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, as well as the work Randy's doing and others. And that's just very exciting. And that has happened since I first started writing these essays. Shall we turn to the audience? Yes.
You will find a lot of first etched into the wall. Look to that. Don't act. You're not learning. Better. No computer, no fancy instruments, no visit, let it stop. Inspiration. One man, human being, creativity, relating these things, and didn't have to look at it would have made me a person. So that's why this creative human beings have to be appreciated, have to be preserved, because if they weren't there, you wouldn't have the incentive. Why? Everything. You wouldn't have that. But it is. And we put it in our minds in the world of that.
Thank you. That was beautifully stated, and I love so many things about it. I love your visceral description of being in places, because we do learn things simply by being in these old places, and they also raise questions in our mind. The guy who's quoted on the screen, Juhani Palasma, also talks about the way being able to see these old places or be around them all the time gives us an understanding of not only the past, but gives us faith in the future. And he speaks very eloquently about that, as well as the experience of it. Other reactions?
We were talking before the session about Eastern State Penitentiary for just a second, and for some reason your appeal reminded me of why Eastern State Penitentiary was designed the way it was in 1829. It was basically to prevent people from having other kind of sensory experiences of any kind of place. It was to isolate them and deprive them of all these kind of inputs that indeed we seek, and a lot of them are this is a really robust list of them, and so I think that's a great point, and we do a lot of things in our society to modify our ability to have those experiences, and we are the public, so it's up to us to inspire people or prevent people from preventing these kinds of experiences from being deprived from them.
Go ahead.
Do you not feel that the National Park Service needs support to help do the preservation work? Because I'm thinking of the building where Jefferson wrote it out, and at 7th and Market Street, and there was a rooming house called the Braff House, which became a hot dog stand, which became, I guess, abandoned, and they had to reconstruct this house, I guess for 1976. I'm not sure the exact date, because it was hot dogs. And okay, so they reconstructed it, and now it's hardly ever open to the tour, because there's no money to keep the National Park Service in there.
So I don't know the specific place, although I'll try to take a look at it. But of course, yes, the National Park Service needs more money to maintain the places that are entrusted to it, and the National Trust actively supports additional funding for the Park Service to deal with its maintenance backlog, and I'm happy to talk with you more about that, but let me take one other question. Anne?
changing this publishing center of Philadelphia, all these buildings have been and if you apply that to every building, like tourists, but there are other how over time layers of
Sure. One of you guys want to respond to that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say a little something. I mean, I think that some of the most exciting old places are when a new use has entered, like a very different use. I mean, the hot dog stand, it's not a use, it's a new place, but sometimes that layering can be really interesting. I mean, and I really wish we allowed for a little more creativity, because I think there's so much room there. I mean, it blows my mind, like, to go to a school, you know, like Penn, and be in the School of Design and be very siloed in historic preservation, and like the students studying architecture aren't really thinking about adaptive reuse or old buildings at all. It's all kind of blank slate, and I just feel like there's so much creative potential with adaptive reuse. And I love that French architecture duo won the Pritzker, who do reuse and just get really creative with it.
And insist on it. They say every demolition is violence.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the quote.
We are absolutely behind on this. Just, sorry, one other follow-up. There's someone, I don't speak German, but someone sent me this statement from like the German Architects Union, or the equivalent of the AIA, who like made a declaration, this was a couple of years ago even, along the same lines. So this, you know, we're behind the times and catching up with the rest of the world.
Paul, and please, if people in the room don't know who you are, please say who you are.
The question comes back to something you said about how many Americans have places where preservation Americans walk younger, though, and we're building here. And one of them is long time daily education. And I'm not calling out with intent. In general, for educating the general population, basic, and produce that's my theory on it. Goes into contractors, deciding. I wonder if you agree with that, or think of that plus something else. How would you characterize?
Well, that's an excellent question. I'll be curious about what Starr and Randy have to say also. What I was thinking about as you were talking about the question is how deeply sad I am about the very poor quality of the places where most Americans live. And I'm not only talking about that on the basis of money, because there are a lot of really expensive neighborhoods that I think don't fulfill a host of humanistic things that would make people's lives better to live there. And I think part of the problem is that people often have never lived in a place that's like a historic center of Philadelphia or a historic center of a European town. And it's hard for them to imagine what it would be like to do that. And I also think, to your precise point, we don't do a good job of talking with them, not only in the educational system, but as family and parents all along the way, to appreciate the place where they're from. I mean, that's how, I'm not sure that was a very good answer, but I'd appreciate it. Yeah.
I feel like it's a tough one to answer. I mean, my mind goes to the fact that we're a relatively young country that has been shaped by a lot of car culture very deliberately, and we've just lost a lot of whatever, those great qualities of small walkable towns that we used to have. I don't know, I have lots of feelings. I mean, we're pretty stretched thin here in terms of social services, so I feel like expectations are pretty low. There's a lot of emphasis on individual property and individualism. Those are my thoughts. They're not fully formed.
I'm maybe even a little less optimistic. I think that what's the story that Americans typically tell about themselves, and it's still manifest destiny, right? Like, I remember learning that in 7th grade and not knowing anything about what it meant, but I feel like I figured it out now. And it seems like, the different versions of manifest destiny just keep rolling over us. The car culture, that was just another way to conquer space in a different way, and to flee problems, not solve problems.
And to make people a lot of money.
Absolutely, and that's what manifest destiny is. It's not a religious idea. It's a way to convert land to capital. Mm-hmm. So I think that is, if that's our big story, then it can be hard for us to get out from under that. There are plenty of alternatives to it, of course, and we are one of them. Preservation is one of the kind of counter movements to that, I would say. But I think that we're not going to be the dominant story, even in the future.
I think, Beth, how are we doing on time? One more question? Someone else? Yes.
I'd like to know if the panelists think the events over the last years, with greater focus on history and its relevance today, will benefit our preservation.
I'll give an unequivocal yes. Yes, definitely it will. And I say that because I don't think our work has ever been more relevant. The work we're doing with African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund is giving people a deep sense of belonging and a sense of identity and history that I think has been long overdue. And it's a part of our changing society. And I would say the same is true I was delighted on my walk over here to see a historical marker to the AIDS library. To be able to have people who have been underrepresented have their history part of it. I just don't think our work's ever been more relevant.
I agree. I think it's a really needed challenge. And I think preservation is very relevant, obviously. It's something I care a lot about. I think also, though, we need to be realistic that we're not the answer to every problem, but we align with a lot of important issues right now. And I think there are definitely ways that preservation can be used as a tool to support a lot of really important causes.
Yes and yes, and I would say that more particularly to preservation as a community or as a profession, to the extent that the current moment is revealing the shortcomings and failures and weaknesses of how we've operated and the results that we've created in the past, that's, I think, an important step ahead. We are not a field that's well known for our critical self-reflection, and so that it's long overdue, I think.